Late 1942. Inside the Abwehr headquarters on the Tirpitzhofer in Berlin, a German intelligence analyst stared at a smuggled report detailing Ford's new Willow Run plant in Michigan. The document made an absurd claim. The factory was preparing to roll a 4-engine B-24 Liberator heavy bomber off the assembly line every 63 minutes. To the traditional German engineering mind, this metric broke every known rule of aviation manufacturing. It had to be a crude typographical error or transparent American propaganda. The analyst faced an immediate dilemma. What exactly do you do with a piece of paper that claims the impossible? The answer, it turned out, was to simply dismiss it. This moment inside the Tirpitzhofer represents one of the most baffling intelligence disconnects of the Second World War. The Third Reich had successfully penetrated the heart of American industrial mobilization through residual pre-war corporate contacts, intercepted communications, and active espionage networks. Berlin possessed highly classified, meticulously accurate data on the United States' capacity to build heavy bombers. Yet, they actively chose to ignore it. Understanding this profound failure requires dismantling the mechanics of wartime industrial espionage and the fraught internal politics of Admiral Wilhelm Canaris's Abwehr. It means looking directly at the ideological blinders of the Nazi leadership, a regime so convinced of its own superiority that it deemed American mass production culturally and fundamentally impossible. The central mystery of this intelligence war is not merely why the German military establishment refused to believe the staggering figures flowing out of factories like Willow Run. The ultimate question is how this institutionalized denial, this state-mandated rejection of objective reality, actively paralyzed their strategic planning, blinding the Reich to a very real mathematical storm that was already gathering across the Atlantic. By the summer of 1942, the strategic reality facing the Third Reich had violently shifted. The swift, localized victories of the Blitzkrieg era had died in the freezing mud outside Moscow the previous winter. Germany was now inextricably locked in a grinding war of attrition on the Eastern Front, fundamentally altering the demands placed on its economy. Yet the German industrial base was ill-equipped for a prolonged, industrialized war of mass scale. It was highly fragmented, fiercely territorial, and deeply politicized. Unlike the centralized, standardized mobilization seen in Britain or the United States, German arms production in early 1942 remained a chaotic web of competing fiefdoms, rival ministries, regional party bosses known as Gauleiters, and entrenched industrial magnates fought bitter bureaucratic wars for limited raw materials, factory space, and skilled labor. Even as Albert Speer assumed control of the Ministry of Armaments that year, attempting to force rationalization onto the economy, he faced a labyrinth of political resistance. This dysfunction was most glaring and most dangerous within the aviation sector. The Luftwaffe was built upon a proud tradition of exceptional engineering and master craftsmanship, a culture that viewed combat aircraft as bespoke instruments of precision rather than disposable commodities. German aircraft manufacturers like Messerschmitt, Heinkel, and Focke-Wulf operated what were essentially massive, glorified workshops. Production relied heavily on the Meister system, utilizing highly skilled artisans who had spent years in apprenticeships. Components were often hand-fitted and manually adjusted on the factory floor. Because they relied on soft tooling and blueprints that required expert interpretation, a door, a wing spar, or an engine cowling from one Messerschmitt Bf-109 might not seamlessly fit onto another without manual filing and manipulation by a mechanic. To further complicate matters, the growing threat of British night raids forced the industry to decentralize, scattering production across hundreds of smaller, dispersed facilities. This methodology guaranteed high-quality, high-performance machines that could outmaneuver the enemy, but it created a permanent supply chain nightmare. It mathematically capped output. German aviation leaders accepted this trade-off, convinced that superior German engineering would always offset any numerical disadvantage. Operating within this framework, they simply could not fathom a system where unskilled laborers could bolt together a complex aircraft using rigid jigs and perfectly interchangeable parts. But this industrial philosophy was also wrapped in a suffocating layer of state-mandated arrogance. At the very top of the command structure, Adolf Hitler enforced a rigid, ideological worldview that fundamentally dismissed the potential of the United States. To the Nazi leadership, America was a culturally degenerate, chaotic society of capitalists and laborers, utterly incapable of unified, total mobilization. Hitler famously assured his inner circle that the United States could only produce razor blades and refrigerators, not serious weapons of war. He viewed American automotive mass production as a civilian gimmick, completely unsuited to the rigorous, exacting demands of military aeronautics. This was not merely private boasting. It was the official, top-down doctrine of the German state. To suggest that the Americans could seamlessly transition from building civilian sedans to producing heavy, four-engine strategic bombers at scale was not just seen as technically incorrect, it was culturally offensive to the Nazi ideal of the German master craftsman. In this environment, objective intelligence became a severe political liability. The entire structure of the Third Reich functioned through a system of competing bureaucracies, where pleasing the Führer and reinforcing his prejudices was the primary currency of survival. For an intelligence officer to walk into a briefing room and present data proving the overwhelming industrial superiority of a national enemy was an act of extreme professional peril. To validate the sheer scale of the American threat was to imply that Germany's grand strategy was flawed, that its industry was inadequate, and that its ultimate defeat was a mathematical certainty. It invited immediate accusations of defeatism, a charge that in 1942 could easily end a military career, or worse, invite the lethal scrutiny of the Gestapo and the SS. Hermann Göring, as the head of the Luftwaffe and the Reich Ministry of Aviation, specifically cultivated this culture of denial, actively shielding Hitler from pessimistic production reports while simultaneously demanding impossible miracles from his own fragmented factories. This was the dangerous reality distortion field in which Admiral Wilhelm Canaris's Abwehr was forced to operate. The military intelligence apparatus was tasked with uncovering the enemy's deepest secrets, yet completely forbidden from letting those secrets contradict the regime's core mythology. They were successfully gathering the data, running the agents, and intercepting the blueprints, but the bureaucratic system itself was designed to automatically reject the diagnosis. And as the American industrial machine began to wake up in the Midwest, this political paradox was about to turn every incoming piece of intercepted manufacturing data into a ticking time bomb on their desks. That time bomb detonated much earlier than American authorities realized. The post-war myth often portrays the United States as an impenetrable fortress of wartime security, but in reality, industrial espionage in early 1942 was alarmingly effective. Neutral diplomats traveling through Detroit, businessmen with lingering pre-war ties to European cartels, and embedded Abwehr informants were actively monitoring the construction of Henry Ford's crowning industrial achievement, the Willow Run bomber plant. They weren't just sending back vague rumors or patriotic newspaper clippings. They were funneling highly credible, granular logistics back to Berlin. The intelligence detailed the laying of millions of bricks, the sprawling 3.5 million square feet of factory floor space, and the unprecedented mile-long, L-shaped assembly line designed expressly for the B-24 Liberator. When these dossiers arrived in Berlin, mid-level analysts and Luftwaffe economists immediately went to work. They took the intercepted American tooling specifications and cross-referenced them against Germany's absolute maximum production capacities. They calculated floor space ratios, machine tool density, and the labor hours required to assemble a heavy, four-engine aircraft. The results completely broke their statistical models. A B-24 Liberator was a massive, highly complex machine composed of over 300,000 individual parts, held together by 360,000 rivets, and containing miles of intricate electrical wiring. According to the data smuggled out of Michigan, Ford wasn't just building a traditional airplane factory. He was building an integrated, mechanized city. The projections showed that once the massive steel stamping presses and rigid custom jigs were fully operational, this single American facility would generate an output that defied German comprehension. The mathematics were terrifying. If the blueprints were accurate, Willow Run alone was gearing up to outproduce the entire combined aviation industry of the Third Reich. This realization triggered an immediate, localized crisis among the intelligence officers. These mid-level analysts found themselves trapped in a dangerous paradox. They were staring at empirical evidence of impending strategic doom, yet they operated in a system where objective truth was lethal. They had two choices. They could sanitize the reports, slash the American production estimates by 70 or 80% to align with the Führer's prejudices, ensuring their own political survival, or They could present the terrifying, unvarnished reality of automotive mass production applied to military aeronautics. In a rare moment of bureaucratic courage, or perhaps sheer analytical stubbornness, the desk officers chose the math over the mythology. They compiled the raw, staggering numbers into formal briefings and pushed them up the chain of command, a fateful decision that would soon trigger one of the most catastrophic institutional failures of the war. By the spring of 1943, those initial, terrifying projections of a mechanized aviation city in Michigan began to materialize into a very different kind of intelligence. The Abwehr was no longer dealing in smuggled blueprints, architectural floor plans, or theoretical factory layouts. They were now tracking a living, breathing, and rapidly accelerating supply chain. Operating out of neutral hubs like Lisbon, Stockholm, and Madrid, German intelligence operatives shifted their focus from stealing secrets to analyzing the massive, open-source logistical wake that a project like Willow Run inevitably generated. They began intercepting maritime shipping manifests destined for North Atlantic convoys and deep diving into American trade publications, heavy industry journals, and regional railway freight schedules. The raw data they compiled painted an undeniable, irrefutable picture of total national mobilization. Abwehr economists cross-referenced rail freight traffic originating in the American Midwest with sudden, massive spikes in bauxite mining in the Caribbean and aluminum processing in the United States. They tracked the movement of specialized machine tools, copper wire, and high-octane aviation fuel. The sheer volume of raw materials flowing toward Ypsilanti, Michigan, perfectly matched the astronomical production capacities outlined in the initial blueprints. Furthermore, neutral press clippings and intercepted diplomatic pouches began yielding physical, photographic evidence. These were not artist renditions or patriotic propaganda posters. They were high-resolution aerial photographs showing a massive, sprawling concrete apron choked with newly minted, unpainted B-24 Liberators, their aluminum skin gleaming in the sun, stretching endlessly toward the horizon. German analysts sitting at desks in the Tirpitzufer meticulously counted the airframes. They calculated the time intervals between the photographs. They analyzed the structural uniformity of the aircraft. The mathematics held absolute. The Ford assembly line was actively churning out a four-engine heavy bomber, a vastly complex machine weighing over 36,000 pounds empty, faster than the master craftsman of the Luftwaffe could build a single-engine fighter. For the intelligence officers, this was a moment of profound, chilling realization. The intelligence was watertight. It had moved beyond theoretical projections and into the realm of hard, verifiable industrial logistics. Every intercepted manifest, every captured shipping document, and every photograph cemented the reality. The American industrial machine had not only awakened, but it was operating at a velocity that completely defied the fundamental laws of European manufacturing. While the desk officers and economists in Berlin furiously tabulated the incoming data from the American Midwest, the frontline elements of the Luftwaffe were experiencing a completely different, much more visceral kind of verification. Throughout the summer and autumn of 1943, the physical reality of the airspace over Western Europe began to violently change. The German air defense grid, anchored by the massive Würzburg and Freya radar installations stretching along the coast of occupied France, Holland, and Belgium, started registering impossible anomalies. Initially, radar operators sitting in darkened bunkers assumed their electronic equipment was malfunctioning. The blips forming over the English Channel were simply too dense, the formations too wide and deep. But as the American 8th Air Force intensified its daylight precision bombing campaign over the continent, the visual confirmation became undeniable. The frontline Jagdgeschwader, the elite, battle-hardened German fighter wings, found themselves flying into an expanding, heavily armed metallic storm. Luftwaffe commanders, men who had dominated the skies over Poland, France, and the early days of the Soviet invasion, were suddenly reporting unexplainable, massive surges in Allied bomber concentrations. They were intercepting massive combat boxes of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, engaging in brutal, high-altitude air battles that stretched across the European continent. The bloody engagements over industrial targets like Schweinfurt and Regensburg were testaments to the lethal proficiency and courage of the German interceptors. The Luftwaffe was extracting a heavy toll, sometimes destroying 20% of an attacking American bomber force in a single afternoon. Yet, the strategic outcome was completely defying German military logic. No matter how many heavy bombers the Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts sent spiraling into the German countryside in flames, the next week, the formations returned. They did not return depleted, battered, or cautious. They returned inexplicably larger. The replacement rate was mathematically terrifying. Frontline officers, including the highly respected General of the Fighters, Adolf Galland, began urgently reporting a critical, widening mismatch between their confirmed kill claims and the sheer, unending volume of enemy aircraft continuously flooding the theater. The pilots sitting in the freezing cockpits of their interceptors did not need to see intercepted blueprints, shipping manifests, or complex floor-space ratios to understand exactly what was happening. The relentless, compounding numbers of heavy bombers filling their Revi gun sights perfectly corroborated the exact warnings the Abwehr field spies had been screaming about for months. The factory in Michigan, alongside dozens of massive facilities rapidly coming online across the United States, were no longer abstract economic concepts debated in Berlin. They were systematically, physically darkening the skies over the Reich. The Luftwaffe was systematically destroying the American vanguard, but they were fighting a hydra. For every B-24 that a German ace managed to shoot down, the sprawling, mile-long assembly line at Willow Run was already stamping out, riveting, and fueling 3 more to take its place. This violent collision of ironclad espionage data from the United States and terrifying combat reports from the European front line forced a direct confrontation at the absolute highest levels of the German military apparatus. Armed with both the verified industrial dossiers and the frantic, desperate combat assessments from the fighter wings, senior intelligence officers requested an urgent, high-level briefing with the Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring. The setting for this encounter was an atmosphere thick with institutional paranoia, shifting political fortunes, and extreme pressure. By mid-1943, Göring's prestige and political capital within the Nazi hierarchy were in a state of steep, irreversible decline. He had publicly promised that he would destroy the Royal Air Force during the Battle of Britain, and he had failed. He had sworn to Adolf Hitler that his Luftwaffe could indefinitely supply the encircled Sixth Army at Stalingrad by air, and he had failed catastrophically. Now, he was failing to protect the sovereign airspace of German cities from the mounting Allied area bombing campaign. His political survival and his standing with the Führer depended entirely on maintaining a strict illusion of control and projecting absolute, unwavering confidence. When the Abwehr officers and Luftwaffe economists laid the Willow Run dossiers on the polished briefing table, clearly outlining the mechanized slaughterhouse of Henry Ford's assembly line and projecting the imminent, unstoppable arrival of thousands of new heavy bombers, the reaction was not one of strategic concern or tactical reassessment. It was a display of volcanic, defensive rage. Göring flatly, categorically refused to look at the mathematics. He violently dismissed the high-resolution aerial photographs, the intercepted maritime manifests, and the meticulously calculated floor-space ratios as transparent, amateurish American propaganda. He accused his own highly trained intelligence analysts of being gullible fools, successfully poisoned by enemy psychological warfare. To Göring, the idea that a nation of shopkeepers, car salesmen, and unskilled laborers could somehow out-engineer the proud, artisanal traditions of the German aviation industry was not just technically impossible, it was racially, ideologically, and culturally insulting. He actively echoed Hitler's precise prejudices, declaring loudly that the Americans were a mongrel nation, capable only of mass-producing civilian frivolities, utterly devoid of the discipline required to build sophisticated instruments of war. But Göring went much further than mere arrogant denial. He weaponized his authority to actively suppress the intelligence. He explicitly, aggressively, ordered the American aircraft production estimates to be slashed by massive, arbitrary margins before they were ever permitted to be included in official strategic summaries destined for Hitler's desk. Any staff officer or intelligence analyst who insisted on presenting the unvarnished numbers or who attempted to validate the frontline reports of the Jagdgeschwader commanders was immediately threatened with severe disciplinary action. In the deeply paranoid, politically lethal ecosystem of the Third Reich, Göring successfully equated mathematical accuracy with outright treason. Pushing the Willow Run data up the chain of command was no longer just an administrative disagreement over industrial capacity. It was formally classified as spreading defeatist rumors. This was a direct crime against the state, an offense that immediately invited the lethal scrutiny of the Gestapo and Heinrich Himmler's internal security apparatus. The truth of American industrial supremacy had officially become illegal to acknowledge. This draconian suppression left Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, the enigmatic and complex head of the Abwehr, navigating a politically toxic and physically dangerous landscape. Canaris was a master of bureaucratic survival, a man who ran Germany's vast global intelligence network while secretly harboring deep, growing disillusionment with the destructive trajectory of the Nazi regime. He understood better than anyone the agonizing, paralyzing paradox of his position. He commanded a highly capable intelligence apparatus that had executed its primary mission flawlessly. They had successfully penetrated the industrial heartland of the primary enemy, bypassed Allied censorship, bypassed the FBI, and stolen the exact secrets necessary to accurately gauge the long-term trajectory of the war. Yet Canaris was structurally, politically forbidden from using that pristine intelligence to alter the strategic course of his own nation. Pushing the accurate Michigan production data meant a direct, open collision with Göring, which in turn meant a fatal collision with Hitler's unyielding ideological mandates. Canaris knew that forcing the issue, standing on the table and demanding they look at the math, would not change German strategic policy. It would only result in the immediate liquidation of his department, the arrest of his best analysts, and his own removal. Therefore, the admiral was forced into a delicate, tragic dance of bureaucratic masking. He allowed the validated reports from his field agents to be diluted. He watched in silence as the staggering, world-altering output of the American Midwest was meticulously downgraded, divided, and sanitized to protect the fragile, inflated egos of the Nazi leadership. The Abwehr continued to function. They continued to gather the data, continued to track the massive shipments of Caribbean aluminum, and continued to count the heavy bombers rolling off the mile-long assembly line at Willow Run. But they were forced to archive reality in highly classified, heavily guarded vaults. The German intelligence organization had achieved a stunning operational victory, mapping the precise industrial capacity of a continent an ocean away, only to be completely neutralized by the willful blindness of its own government. It was a profound institutional paralysis, a scenario where the precise mechanism designed to see the future was deliberately, forcefully blinded by the men steering the ship of state. The ultimate consequence of this bureaucratic suppression was a fatal, irreversible disconnect between the insulated fantasy maintained in Berlin and the creeping, mechanical horror experienced on the front lines. Inside the cavernous ministries of the capital, Nazi officials, sycophantic generals, and party loyalists continued to operate under a wholly fabricated sense of security. Because Göring and the High Command had officially mandated that the American heavy bomber fleets did not, and could not, exist at such staggering scale, the strategic planning for the air defense of the Reich proceeded at a lethargic, entirely inadequate pace. Priority remained rigidly focused on offensive weapons, the development of vengeance rockets, and the grueling mechanized ground war consuming millions of men in the East. They genuinely believed that by legally burying the intelligence dossiers, by forbidding the mention of Willow Run in official briefings, they had somehow neutralized the threat. They rested secure in their ideological belief that superior German engineering, tactical brilliance, and sheer willpower would effortlessly swat away whatever meager, mass-produced forces the Americans managed to scrape together and deploy over Europe. But outside the heavily guarded walls and paneled offices of the ministries, a very different, deeply unforgiving reality was taking hold. On the battered, windswept airfields of occupied France, Holland, and the industrial Ruhr Valley, German fighter pilots, exhausted mechanics, and anti-aircraft crews were entirely isolated from the comforting political propaganda of Berlin. They did not care about ideological mandates, racial theories, or Goering's heavily redacted strategic reports. They were living the mathematics of Willow Run every single day. As 1943 slowly bled into 1944, the men on the ground watched with mounting, paralyzing dread as the skies above them filled with an ever-expanding, seemingly infinite armada of silver and olive-drab aluminum. The initial arrogant dismissal that had characterized the Luftwaffe's early, victorious encounters with American aviators slowly evaporated, replaced by a cold, undeniable terror of scale. They were fighting an industrial machine that did not tire, did not pause, and replaced its combat losses with a terrifying mechanical efficiency that no amount of German heroism could stem. The political leadership in Berlin had successfully classified the truth as fiction, demanding that the crushing reality of American automotive mass production be treated as a ridiculous myth. They had legally mandated that the enemy's greatest weapon did not exist. But ignoring a mathematical certainty does not stop that certainty from physically crossing the Atlantic Ocean. The post-war narrative often stops there, comfortably framing this catastrophic denial as the single fatal flaw of arrogance that doomed the Luftwaffe. But a closer examination of German economic archives reveals a much darker structural paralysis hidden beneath the surface of Goering's rage. The terrifying reality is that even if Adolf Hitler and the High Command had stared at those intercepted blueprints in 1942 and fully accepted the 63-minute Willow Run metric, it likely would not have changed the outcome. Acknowledging a threat does not spontaneously generate the means to defeat it. Germany fundamentally lacked the foundational resources required to match American mass production. By the time the Abwehr deciphered the scale of Ford's operation, the Third Reich was already experiencing critical shortages of raw bauxite necessary for aluminum production. Their electrical grids, essential for the massive energy demands of smelting, were stretched to the breaking point. They possessed nothing comparable to the unified, transcontinental logistical network that allowed the United States to seamlessly funnel rubber, copper, and steel into Michigan without interruption. More crucially, the German aviation industry completely lacked the standardized machine tooling necessary to replicate an operation like Willow Run. You cannot simply issue a Führer directive ordering master craftsmen, men accustomed to hand-fitting individual Messerschmitt canopies, to suddenly transition to rigid, mechanized assembly lines. That kind of systemic shift requires years of capital investment, deeply ingrained industrial standardization, and a fundamentally different engineering philosophy. Germany, bleeding manpower and resources in the Soviet Union, had neither the time nor the physical capacity to retool its entire economy. This exposes the harsh, unforgiving truth of military espionage. The most accurate intelligence in the world is entirely useless if a nation lacks the industrial capacity to act upon it. The Abwehr's meticulous dossiers were, strategically speaking, dead on arrival. For the Nazi leadership, openly admitting that Henry Ford was building a heavy bomber every hour would not have miraculously produced more interceptors to defend the Reich. It would only have forced the regime to look at the ledgers and formally admit that the war of attrition was mathematically lost, long before those newly built planes ever arrived. That mathematical certainty finally arrived over the capital in the early months of 1944. The theoretical discussions regarding American industrial capacity abruptly ended as the United States Army Air Forces launched massive, coordinated daylight offensives deep into German airspace. In the heavily reinforced basements beneath the Tierpitzhofe in Berlin, the same Abwehr analysts who had originally deciphered the smuggled blueprints from Michigan now sat in the dark, listening to the deafening wail of air raid sirens. The abstract logistical data they had desperately tried to push up the chain of command 2 years prior was no longer trapped in a bureaucratic filing cabinet. It was physically manifesting directly above their heads. Through the thick concrete ceilings of the command bunkers, the intelligence officers could feel the deep, synchronized vibration of thousands of heavy Pratt & Whitney engines resonating in the freezing air. The impossible metrics, the 63-minute assembly cycles, the mile-long production lines, the staggering floor space ratios had materialized into massive, overlapping combat boxes of B-24 Liberators. When the bomb bay doors opened over the Reich, the collision of dismissed intelligence and physical reality became violently literal. This was the ultimate devastating vindication of the German espionage network. The field agents stationed in neutral ports had been entirely correct. The economists who calculated the output of Willow Run had been flawless in their assessments. Yet their reward for this unparalleled intelligence triumph was the systematic obliteration of their own cities. As high explosives and incendiaries tore through the ministries, railway yards, and industrial districts of Berlin, the analysts could only sit in the dark and endure the concussive shockwaves of their own ignored warnings. Every detonation shaking the bunker walls was a direct kinetic translation of the maritime shipping manifests they had intercepted. Every city block reduced to ash was the physical result of the Caribbean bauxite and Midwestern steel they had meticulously tracked. The Nazi High Command had demanded a reality where American mass production was a cultural impossibility, shielding themselves with ideological arrogance and forged strategic summaries. But the bombs falling from the bellies of the Liberators did not require ideological approval to detonate. The intelligence apparatus had successfully mapped the exact dimensions of the industrial storm, only to be locked inside the house as it made landfall. The impossible number on a smuggled piece of carbon paper had finally, irreversibly, translated into the physical destruction of the capital. Looking back at that initial, unbelievable report sitting on an analyst's desk at the Tirpitzufer, it becomes clear that the Abwehr did not fail in its primary duty. The German espionage network had successfully penetrated the enemy's industrial heartland and extracted the exact metrics of their own impending doom. The story of Willow Run proves a cold, unyielding law of modern conflict. Intelligence is only as valuable as a leadership's willingness to accept uncomfortable truths and actually act upon them. This specific intelligence failure remains vital for understanding the broader collapse of the German war machine. The Third Reich was ultimately destroyed not just by a lack of resources, but because its very ideological framework made it structurally incapable of processing the mathematical reality of industrial warfare. They had built a political system that demanded absolute adherence to a rigid mythology of cultural and racial superiority. When faced with empirical evidence that contradicted that mythology, when confronted with the staggering, mechanized output of the American Midwest, the system automatically rejected the data rather than adapt to the threat. It was a perfect, closed, self-defeating loop. The Nazi leadership actively chose blindness over survival, prioritizing political conformity over strategic reality. They possessed the exact logistical roadmap of the American aviation industry, meticulously compiled, verified, and translated into German. Yet, they locked it away in heavily guarded vaults because the numbers were politically offensive. The tragedy of this perfect intelligence was that the men making the decisions never lacked the information necessary to understand the coming storm. They simply lacked the ideological capacity to believe it. In the end, the blueprint of their own destruction had been sitting quietly in their own archives all along. The German espionage network had executed its mission with chilling perfection, successfully stealing the exact blueprints of America's industrial miracle long before the skies darkened over Europe. But as the smoldering ruins of the Reich would ultimately prove, the most devastating weapon of the war was never a heavy bomber rolling off an assembly line in Michigan. It was a simple, mathematical truth that their own commanders fundamentally refused to read.